Shakespeare loves a flashy opening, something to grab the attention of those rowdy groundlings coming to see his plays, something to quiet everybody down fast and get them hooked. The Tempest starts with a shipwreck. Romeo and Juliet starts with a brawl. Hamlet starts with a ghost. Twelfth Night starts with a pathetic guy asking for a sad song. Okay, Twelfth Night may not be the best example, but Macbeth is. Macbeth begins with witches, plotting witches, and we only get to hear the end of their conversation, which makes them even more mysterious. All we know is that they have a plan to meet up again soon. Upon the heath, they are to meet with Macbeth. And it's a great hook. I mean, what are these mysterious women planning for Macbeth? Their presence in this opening scene functions to set the tone and setting for the entire play. They leave the stage with an absolutely haunting rhyming couplet. Fair is foul, and foul is fair. Hover through the fog and filthy air. Even though this play would be originally staged outside in the open air on all sorts of days, Shakespeare tells us how we need to imagine the setting. It's filled with fog and filthy air. That's the setting. That's the tone. And of course, they're not just providing us with a visual image to understand the setting. If we're paying attention, they're going to help us unlock a bunch of themes within the play. I'm going to argue here, eventually, that the witches are even an allegory for theater itself. I've said this before, and I'm going to say it again. Great literature teaches you how to read it. The musical character Feste taught us how to read Twelfth Night. The Fool teaches us how to read Lear. And the witches are going to teach us how to read Macbeth. And that's what we're going to talk about today. And if that sounds like it's your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. And with that out of the way, let's talk about the witches in Macbeth. Before we can fully dig into the analysis, a few words need to be spoken here about the witch in history and the way that Shakespeare's contemporary audience might respond to a witch on the stage. This play first appeared on the English stage in the very early 17th century when James I was King of England. In academic circles, it's been a joke since at least the early 90s that anybody that's about to discuss this topic has to start by saying that King James I was fascinated by witches. I mean, a group of witches once tried to kill him. Of course he was interested. The story goes that he was sailing back to Scotland from Copenhagen, where he had married Queen Anne, when the royal couple experienced some stormy weather. Afterwards, a group of witches in Denmark, both men and women, confessed to causing it, and this prompted James to set up his own investigation in Scotland. So yeah, James believed in witches. He believed that witches made a compact with the devil and tried to kill him. He even wrote a book about them. So Shakespeare wrote a play set in Scotland that features witches to appeal to a king born in Scotland obsessed with witches. And that's why witches appear in the play. But that's obviously all a bit reductive. We can do better. We should do better. Yes, it's true that James initiated and participated in the North Berwick witch trials in the early 1590s. Yes, it's true that James was a fan of the Malleus Maleficarum, an influential book about witchcraft from the late 15th century. Yes, it's true that he wrote his own book about witchcraft in 1597 called The Demonology, but this does not mean that witchcraft was a particularly hot topic in the early 1600s when James began his reign in England. In fact, one could argue that England's interest in witchcraft was in steep decline when Shakespeare decided to include them in his Scottish play. The historical records show that the persecution of witches in England peaked in the 1580s and the very early 1590s, around the same time that James suspected witches of creating the storms that threatened his life. But fads come and go. What was popular in the early 1590s might not have been particularly popular by the late 1590s. In fact, by the time we get to the early 16th century, there was a bit of a reaction against witch trials. The most influential part of this reaction is a book called The Discoverie of Witchcraft, written by Reginald Scot, which argued that the belief in witchcraft was irrational and anti-Christian. He argues that a belief in witchcraft is simply the result of people looking for a figure to embody their anxieties. Scott included some straightforwardly logical takedowns, such as, if all the devils in hell were dead, and all the witches in England burnt, or hanged, I warrant you we should not fail to have rain, hail, and tempests. So blaming these weather events on witchcraft is misguided and immature. And so I find it interesting that while actual prosecutions of witches peaked in the mid to late 1580s, Hardly any witches appeared on the actual Elizabethan stage. But as the belief in witchcraft began to wane in the early 1600s, witches began to appear on the Jacobean stage. And it's not just Macbeth. Ben Jonson produced A Masque of Queens, Thomas Middleton produced The Witch. It became popular on the stage after it became less popular in the courtroom. And sure, maybe this is because the playwrights were pandering to James's belief in witchcraft. But there's also the possibility that these playwrights were excavating the narrative potential of witchcraft skepticism. If witches were, as Scot argued, an embodiment of our anxieties, then it makes sense to put them on stage. They'd make great characters. When Reginald Scot characterized self-proclaimed witches as either mad or tricksters, it calls out the performative nature of the witch. And anytime a performance has an impact on actual behavior, theaters are going to take note. The historian Diane Purkiss notes that it is significant that the first play to feature a witch in a major part was not written until after the publication of Scott's treatise, some 3 years after the beginning of the witch panic at court. So witchcraft skepticism gave playwrights a fertile metaphor to work with. My point in bringing all this up is to avoid a reductive reading of the witches that begins with the premise that everybody in Shakespeare's time believed in witches, and that this would have been a scary opening scene because it reflected real beliefs. It didn't. The belief in witchcraft was in decline, or at least hotly contested. But witches do make for a dramatic plot device. They appear on stage as both a contested superstition and a real belief, as both supernatural and natural, or as both fantasy and reality. In other words, they share a lot with the theater. The witches occupy that space between categories, between imagination and reality, and Shakespeare uses them to help his audience better read his play. So I'm going to walk through 2 examples of this. First, I'm going to look at how he uses the witches to investigate the failure of linguistic categories to name and control human communities. And second, I'm going to analyze how the existence of the witches in this play complicate our understanding of individual autonomy. In other words, the witches help us question the linguistic structures that we use to understand the world, and they force us to question our ability to control our own lives. So let's start with the linguistic structures argument. Act 1, Scene 3 opens with the 3 witches as they banter about what they've each been up to. Their dialogue is largely incomprehensible, and though there are some references to common tropes about witchcraft, these witches do not fit neatly into any one tradition or vision of witchcraft within the contemporary discourse on witchcraft. For example, the second witch says that she's been killing swine, which is a reference to some actual historical accusations of witchcraft, but they also make a bunch of fart jokes, and they reference a topical news story about a pirate attack on a ship called the Tiger that has nothing to do with witchcraft. So they're all over the place. They can't be pinned down to any one specific tradition or understanding of witchcraft. The historian of witchcraft, Diane Purkiss, has gone so far as to say that the Witches of Macbeth are a low-budget, frankly exploitative collage of randomly chosen bits of witch lore selected not for thematic significance, but for its sensation value, pandering shamelessly to the novelty-hungry news culture of Jacobean London, and to a court of intellectual elite increasingly eager for narratives of folklore which would demonstrate their separation from a credulous peasantry. The witch scenes brazenly refuse any serious engagement with witchcraft in favor of a forthright rendering of witches as a stage spectacular. These all-singing, all-dancing witches bear about as much relation to the concerns of village women as the sound of music does to women's worries about childcare in the 1990s. Shakespeare buries popular culture under a thick top-dressing of exploitative sensationalism, unblushingly strip-mining both popular culture and every learned text he can lay his hands on for the sake of creating an arresting stage event. And that's about as hard as I've ever heard a historian go. And from this position, that the witches are a low-budget exploitative collage of randomly chosen bits of witch lore, she comes to an interesting conclusion. The Witches of Macbeth are equivocal, or unreadable texts, which the characters must but cannot interpret successfully. They exist outside the realm of human comprehension. They exist outside the ability of the audience, or Macbeth, or Banquo, to understand or interpret them. When Banquo first meets the witches, he says, What are these, so withered and so wild in their attire, that look not like the inhabitants of the earth, and yet are on it? Live you? Or are you aught that many may question? You seem to understand me, by each at once her choppy finger laying upon her skinny lips. You should be women, and yet your beards forbid me to interpret that you are so. So he's not sure what they are. He doesn't know if they're inhabitants of the earth. He's not sure if they're alive. He's not sure if they understand him. They don't fit neatly into the gender binary. He wants to interpret their bodies as female, but the beards complicate that interpretation. They are, as Purkiss says, uninterpretable texts. We do not have the language or epistemological frameworks to categorize them effectively. And Shakespeare exploits this breakdown in Banquo's hermeneutics to point the audience towards an important theme of the play. Specifically, the unreadable nature of the witches highlights how the play explores the limitations of human language. When Macbeth confronts the sisters in Act 4 and asks them directly what it is they do, they respond by saying a deed without a name, and by doing so, they even avoid self-definition. They exist and operate in a world beyond names, beyond language, and therefore beyond human comprehension. We understand the world through language. We categorize our experiences by naming them. But then the world never actually fits neatly into those categories. There's always ambiguity. The binaries never hold. The witches embody this ambiguity, and the play dramatizes the resulting implications of those cognitive and hermeneutic limitations. So now we can apply this concept to the rest of the play. This scene, where Banquo acknowledges the limitations of his interpretive abilities, comes directly after a scene where Duncan learns about the fighting going on in his kingdom. Duncan seems like a decent enough guy with a strong integrity. He shows gratitude and concern for his soldiers, for example. It seems like his greatest mistake in this entire play is that he trusted people a little bit too much. We're tempted, from our position in the audience, to put him into the category of good king. He seems like a nice guy. But then Banquo and the witches call our attention to our inability to fully understand the world around us, and this might force us to reflect on our own hermeneutical limitations. We might recognize that the people of Scotland have risen up against Duncan. We might recognize that Duncan felt he could trust Cawdor in the same ways that we think that we can trust him, and in the same ways that he's going to mistakenly trust Macbeth in the following act. So much of the world exists beyond our ability to correctly interpret it. We want to put Duncan into that category of good king. Duncan wants to place Macbeth in the category of trustworthy soldier, but those categories are too broad to be meaningfully applied to actual complicated human beings. Sure, Duncan has some qualities of a good king, but that's not the full story of Duncan. He's much more complicated than our titles can handle. The witches tell us in the very first scene of the play that the battle has been lost and won, which could be interpreted as a paradox, but of course, it's not. Every battle is both lost and won. The interpretation depends on somebody's subjective position. Since the witches interpret the battle as both lost and won, we have to assume that they exist outside of the subjectivities that concern themselves with the battle. They're on neither side. They also tell us that what is foul is fair, and what is fair is foul, and of course, they're right. Though Duncan seems fair and conventionally good, his reign seems to be foul. It depends on violent suppression, a seemingly constant state of warfare, so fair is actually foul. Similarly, later in the play, Macduff's entire family is going to be slaughtered. Foul. Surely that is unambiguously foul. But it inspires Macduff to push back harder against Macbeth's tyranny. So that's good. Maybe that's a fair response, a foul act that then created a fair response. We can look at anything in the play through this lens of relativism and subjective context. Every act can be read and interpreted from multiple subjectivities, and nobody ever has a claim to the correct interpretation. Banquo wants to interpret the witches as female, but their beards complicate that. Lady Macbeth is a lady, but she asks the spirits to unsex her. Beneath the feminine, there is always the masculine. Similarly, Duncan and Malcolm appear masculine, but both have maternal qualities beneath the surface. Physical appearance may not provide insights into one's character. Our actual lived experience of the world is filled with these sorts of competing claims that defy simple categorization and fixed interpretation. And there's something obviously revolutionary and subversive in that idea. The Society of Scotland tries to pretend as though its hierarchies are natural and fixed, that there are kings and thanes, and that those kings and thanes have a natural right to privileges. But the witches tell us that nature is not ordered so neatly. Those hierarchies are not natural, but constructed through language. What is lost for one will be won by another. What is foul for one will be fair for another. We all have claims that will conflict with the claims of somebody else, and acknowledging this forces us to question the hierarchies positioned as natural within the play and our world. No single person has a claim to correct interpretation. No one's subjectivity outranks another person's subjectivity. Those fancy titles that place one person above another person have the same limitations as everything else. All the hierarchies that they create are just fog and filthy air. And yet, the play ends with Malcolm introducing new titles. In the final scene of the play, he distinguishes his closest allies as earls, the first that ever Scotland in such honor named, and you can just imagine the witches peeking their heads out and giving him the side eye here. He's just recreating the same power structures and hierarchical categories that failed in the past, but this time he's given them new names. New language that's bound to fail. Macbeth is a play about the moral ambiguity inherent to subjective interpretation, and I think that might be why this play is so popular to teach in high school classrooms. That sort of thing makes for really good class discussion. For example, I could imagine a teacher asking, to what extent are the witches responsible for Macbeth's downfall? They say he will become king, and then he does. Is that destiny, or did their words simply awaken something already inside Macbeth, his personal ambition? Was Macbeth destined for tragedy, or is he responsible for his own tragedy? Appropriately, I actually think the witches can help us investigate these questions. If you look up the etymology of the word weird, as in the Weird Sisters, you'll find that the word shares a root with the Old English word for fate, weird. Similarly, in Greek mythology, there are three fates who weave the thread of various human lives together in a giant tapestry. So having these three weird sisters meet on stage right away points us toward the concept of fate in a number of ways. Not the least of which is that they speak in prophecies. Banquo says that they seem to understand his language, but they never actually respond to any question that they've asked. They dialogue with each other, but when speaking with Macbeth and Banquo, they only utter prophetic statements. They tell Macbeth and Banquo their future. And yet, Macbeth and Banquo do not leave this encounter confident about their future. They don't accept the utterances as truth. Instead, they debate whether or not the witches dissolved into the air or into the earth, whether or not they just had a real experience or a hallucination. The subtext here is a debate about whether or not they were witches aligned with the devil or fates associated with prophecy, whether or not that was a devilish temptation or a simple description of their future. And of course, that is never answered. The witches will remain uninterpretable texts, but they give us a new lens with which to interpret the text in front of us. Shortly after that meeting with Macbeth and Banquo, we are introduced to Lady Macbeth, who discusses Macbeth's innate qualities. She tells us that Macbeth is not without ambition, but that he might be too full of the milk of human kindness to attend to that ambition. Consequently, she commits herself to pour her spirit in his ear and chastise with the valor of her tongue all that impedes him from the golden round, which fate and metaphysical aid doth seem to have him crowned withal. So she's going to pour spirits into his ear. She's going to tell him stories that he needs to hear in order to overcome his own kindness and be the king that he's destined to be. And this should further complicate our understanding of how much control we have over our own lives. Like, pretend the witches don't exist. Pretend that they never said anything. It's unclear to me whether or not Lady Macbeth would push Macbeth in a more ambitious direction. It kinda seems to me like she would. The witches poison Macbeth's brain with a fantasy of power, but so does his wife. Stephen Greenblatt explains that Lady Macbeth gives voice to Macbeth's inner life, releasing in him the same forbidden desire that the witches have called forth. To act on this desire is what it means in the play to be a man. In other words, in order to better fit the category of man, he has to eliminate the feminine milk of human kindness and pursue his desires, his ambition for power. But does he instigate his own tragedy, or does that pre-existing coercive definition of masculinity instigate his tragedy? Is his inborn intrinsic ambition responsible for his downfall? Or was he destined for tragedy because of the pernicious stories about masculinity the world poured into his ear and forced upon him? Or to put it more simply, is Macbeth's locus of control internal or external? And this, of course, brings us back to the witches. Do they simply describe the ambitions inside Macbeth when they tell him that he'll be king, or does the story that they tell influence him and change the way that he understands himself? And in a larger sense, are we, in the audience, the way that we are because of something inside of us, or because of the stories that surround us? And the way that we answer these questions has implications on the way that we interact with the text that we've been reading or the play that we've been watching. So, to recap, the witches blur the boundaries that distinguish any category, but specifically, they blur the line between fantasy and reality, the supernatural and the natural, the imagination and the terrestrial world. They also expose the difficulty in distinguishing the individual will from the incentive structures created by the culture that surrounds us. The witches are uninterpretable texts. And it's good to remember that all that stuff can also be said of the poetry that we witness on stage every time we see Macbeth performed. Theater, and the arts generally, blur the boundaries between fantasy and reality, the supernatural and the natural, the cosmic and the terrestrial. We all experience the play as individuals from our own specific subjectivity, but the meaning of any given performance is a collaboration between the audience and the actors. Any interpretation will be both individual and collective. Theater blurs the lines between the individual and the context within which the individual finds themselves. And it's also worth noting at this point that in the original productions of this play, the female characters would have been played by male actors. I'm sure that some Banquo in the audience would say, you should be women, and yet your beards forbid me to interpret that you are so. The witches and good theater forbid definitive and fixed interpretation. The diverse ways that we interpret the witches reflect the diverse ways that we think about theater and the stories that shape the values of our community. Shakespeare obviously found value in this association between witchcraft and his profession. Prospero in The Tempest is the most obvious example of this. He's clearly a witch in the play, but he's also clearly an allegory for the playwright. Theater inhabits the borderland between the divine and the human, and has the power to change our understanding of ourselves from a place outside of ourselves. The witches tell Macbeth a story, and that story awakens something inside him. Shakespeare tells us a story, and that story awakens something inside all of us. What that might be is up for interpretation, and interpretation is notoriously tricky. And that's all I got for this season of Shakespeare Play-by-Play. I'm going to work on a comedy next, which should be published sometime in the spring. Please subscribe to be notified when that's published, and thank you for watching.